Hello, world history. This is Miss Corey. Today we're going to do U5-L5, Ancient Japan, Heian, and Shogunates. Ooh, fun stuff. All right, so you're going to watch this edit puzzle and answer the questions. Questions I asked you during the video today that will be in blue text are going to be questions I want you to answer directly on the edit puzzle. Make sure you're following along with your study guide because any important concepts on this study guide will be in red highlighted text because the background is maroon, so red text does not show up super well, so that's why it's highlighted today. And of course, if you have questions, please let me know. Today's learning targets are that students can describe the development of civilizations in Eastern Asia. Today we're going to focus on Japan. Analyze the emergence, development, and impact of philosophies of this era. So we'll learn a little bit about the Shinto religion and compare and contrast the cultures of China and Japan, including the consolidation of belief systems. So buckle up. We are about to start in ancient Japan in 202 BCE, and we're going to fly all the way to 1868 CE. Yeah, that's right, 1868. That was less than 200 years ago. All right, so let's start with early Japan. So it was inhabited about 30,000 years ago by humans. That's when Japan's southernmost island was much closer, if not touching, the Korean peninsula. So if you see on this tiny map, I have a bigger map in a little bit, but you can see that Korea and Japan are incredibly close to each other. Japan is also something called an archipelago. So an archipelago is a group of islands scattered in the ocean. So Japan is not just like one giant landmass. It is a bunch of little islands that are super duper close together. There's more of the zoomed in map. So as you can see here, Japan and South Korea are very close to each other. This is a modern day map of Japan, by the way. And you can see that there's 4 main islands up here. So you have this island, this big kind of long island, and then 2 smaller but still large islands. You can also see Japan is fairly close to Russia, as well as kind of bordering on the China and, of course, the Koreas as well. So the first written record about Japan was written in 111 CE by a Chinese writer. So the Japanese language was brought from the Korean peninsula in the 300 CE. Beforehand, the Japanese language was not what you think about today. It was a bunch of native languages that would be very different than what the modern day Japanese language was. And Japanese is a direct descendant of the Chinese language. And that's the reason why there are so many syllables that are written the same, if not similar. So prior to contact with China, so that's about the 300 CE, Japan was a hunter-gatherer society. We talked about that in Unit 1, so that's where they hunt for their food and they gather their food. There's also some small farming, as well as fishing. That was a really big industry. It was also made up of small communities and some smaller kingdoms. The largest of the ancient Japanese kingdoms was something called Yamatai, which lasted from about 1000 BCE until about 300 CE. And during this time period, there was like some contact with China and Korea, but it wasn't very much. Like they knew each other existed, but there was very little trading going on. The other thing that's really important to learn about Japan is that the soil is very thin. So we talked about this during our Greek unit about how their soil is also super thin and not good for farming. It's going to be the same thing with Japan. Japan is pretty much just a giant like strip of volcanoes. And although volcano soil can be really nutrient rich, it's also very thin. So there's not much you can farm. So before the arrival of Buddhism in 500 CE, and we'll talk about Buddhism, I think, next unit, because that's a pretty big religion. The religion of early Japan was something called Shinto. Shinto means way of the divine beings. So it was worshiping multiple gods. Most of these gods were not widespread. They were just local deities. There were a few that were kind of the big major gods. And it was also influenced life actions a human should do. So Shinto gods were worshipped as shrines. A torii is an arch representing the gateway to the human world and divine shrine. So the torii are these like little red gates here. There's also 7 good luck gods, which would also be the most worshipped gods. So let's talk about the Heian period now. So the Heian period was from 794 until 1185 CE. The capital is in Heian. Today, Heian is a city called Kyoto, and Heian means peace. And it remained the capital of all of Japan until 1185. So here is a modern day map, of course, but Heian, again, is now called Kyoto. So Kyoto/Heian would be right here. Now the modern day capital of Japan is Tokyo, which is over here. All right, so in the Heian period, they were quote unquote ruled by an emperor, but I put that in quotes because the emperor actually didn't rule politically. Behind the scenes, the real rulers were these people called the Fujiwara clan. And the Fujiwara clan was this very influential family who made women marry into the royal family, having a lot more influence on who would be the next emperor. So, during the Heian period, Japan was less dependent on China and more focused on making their own national culture separated from China. Although they still had trade with China, they became a lot more self-sufficient. They also had more of importance on royal courts, so that would be like the emperor's advisors and family. And they also had a lot more of a focus on art and literature as well. And the time period in the Heian period is where women would paint their teeth black. They would pluck their eyebrows and they would wear powdered lead makeup. But of course, back then they didn't know lead was super poisonous. And they were like the upper class women also would wear 12 layers of robes. So in the Heian period, it was kind of peaceful. There were no widespread wars, but there was a lot of minor violence in between like ruling lords. During this time period, too, the rich got richer, but the poor got poorer. So the rich were typically these ryomens who were nobles, and there was about 5,000 of them throughout Japan, and they got rich. But the rest of the 5 million Japanese people, they got poorer. So the government didn't make a police force. So when you don't have a police force, that means that any laws that go into effect really don't matter because there's no one there to enforce those laws. So that meant there was a lot of crime throughout Japan. And traders and travelers often got robbed. And there was no government source of money as well. So each region would have their own kind of currency. Rice became the money. So if you wanted something, more than likely, they'd ask you to trade for a certain amount of rice. And rice fields were also very controversial because they were controlled mostly by the Fujiwara family, who also ruled the government. So the later Heian period, so this would be like after the 1000 CE, they still had an emperor, but this shogun was the real ruler behind the scenes. So think of it this way. In modern terms, we have like the King of England, right? So I think his name's King Charles, right? He is the king, but he really doesn't have any political power. It's the prime minister, who is this dude right here. I forget his name, I'm sorry. But he's really the one that's calling all the shots. He's making all the big decisions, the laws, stuff like that. So think of kind of like the King of England with his not a lot of power being like the Japanese emperor, and the prime minister that actually has the power being like the shogun. Okay? Shogun's going to pop up a lot as a word. So make sure you remember what it is. So here's a hierarchy chart of Japan. So you can see at the bottom we have merchants, then we have peasants and artisans. Up here we have samurai warriors. We'll talk about the samurai in just a little bit. Then, of course, we have the daimyo. So the daimyo is an also really important vocab word. They were the wealthy landowners, okay? And then the shogun, who was the actual ruler of Japan. And then on the very top was the emperor. But again, the emperor really didn't have any political power. He was just there for like the figurative role. So, emperor versus shogun, what's the difference? Again, emperor is just a figurehead, had no real political power. He was seen to be chosen by the gods. He also conducted religious ceremonies, and he pretty much just looks cool while the shogun and daimyo do all the work. And Japan, to this day, still has an emperor. The shogun was originally just the head of the military, but then he moved to rank the one who controls the military. And the person who controls the military controls the country. And then after 1185, he had the power to rule all of Japan's governments, not just the military at that point. He's also ruling the economy and all the other little pieces. All right, now let's talk about the samurai. So, samurai means one who serves. And they existed from about the 1100s until 1876 when they were outlawed during the Meiji Restoration. In the 1100s, they were warriors for hire. So the national government didn't have its own solid army, and landowners needed to protect their property. So what they would do is they would hire these samurai to protect their property and their land and their house and their people. So lords, who were people appointed by national government to look over the large area of lands, were the main employers of samurai. And lords in Japanese are called daimyos. Daimyos need to protect their peasants, their farmland, and themselves from rival lords. So to kind of put into perspective here of how desperate these daimyos were to have samurai to protect their land, here is kind of a map of all the different broken up sections of Japan. So all these little borders that you see along here, these all tiny little borders are going to be daimyos who are fighting against each other of who's getting the best land, who's stealing from who, who's going to invade who, and they needed those samurai in order to protect their borders. So in 1180 to 1185, there's a war that breaks out. It's called the Genpei War, and it overthrew the Heian government and established a new military government called the Kamakura Shogunate. And during the Kamakura Shogunate, this would place samurai as warriors and soldiers for the government. So some samurai became very wealthy and high status because of this, but it's really important to note that not all samurai were rich or upper tier of society. Most samurai were just foot soldiers. Ronin were samurais without masters or not accepted by a master, and they typically would just travel around in search for work. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and skip a few years because we'd be here all day talking about Japanese history otherwise. So, Japan has a warring states period between 1467 and 1615. Here's a map of the warring state period where you can see all the different colors represent all these different daimyos, and where the daimyos and clans battle for the control of Japan. This ended up in an ongoing civil wars, and Japan was constantly being split up between rulers and changing shoguns. It was pretty much just chaos politically. But there is hope for Japan to be reunited. All they need is a bigger enemy than themselves. So, here's a question. Who will be that enemy that will reunite Japan? Take your best guess. Who is going to be the enemy that reunites Japan? It's the United States. Yeah, that's right. The US. Woohoo! Look at us. Ugh. All right. So Britain, Russia, and the United States are going to be that bigger fish that Japan is like, oh boy, we got to unite or else they're going to totally conquer us. So, before 1792, Japan had a very unstable central government. Japan had no contact with the rest of the world besides China and Korea. So they had a law that no one could do trade with other countries. There were some black market and pirating that did occur during this time, but like you couldn't be in Europe and be like, hey, I would really like some Japanese pottery. It didn't exist. Japan didn't trade. And they also didn't have a centralized government to import, export, or regulate goods. So in 1792, Russian and British merchant ships sat on the shores of Japan. And Japanese daimyos were like, oh crap. If Russia and Britain comes to attack us, we have no central military force to fight back, right? Because they just had a bunch of samurai and they weren't united. So Japan unites under two main daimyos, the Satsuma and Choshu. And they build up a united army, arsenal, and shipyards. And they move their capital from Kyoto. Now they move it to Edo, which today we call Tokyo. The US is back though. So Matthew C. Perry from the US Navy comes with an armed US Navy fleet in 1853. And Japan is like, oh crap, they're here. The Americans are here. So Perry commands Japan to trade with the West. And in 1854, Japan is forced to sign a treaty with the United States and other Western countries to do trading. The name of this treaty is the Treaty of Kanagawa. I won't get too much into that though. So Japanese merchants are super duper angry at the Japanese government that they let these Westerns come in for trading. And these Japanese merchants and people treat foreigners terribly. British and French government were so fed up with the way that foreigners were treated that they're like, what the heck, Japan? Don't treat our merchant poorly. So in response, Britain and France park their boats right outside of the southwest coast of Japan, and they take their cannons and they just bomb the crap out of the southwest coast of Japan in 1864 in rebellion for the Japanese people treating the foreigners so terribly. So, the economic and physical pressure of Western forces leads to the overthrowing of the Japanese government. This then leads to something called the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration happened from 1868 to 1894. It's called that because that's the name of the emperor. That's this dude right here. So, when Japan fully embraces the ideas and cultures from other countries is during the Meiji Restoration. And we'll come back to the Meiji Restoration maybe during the World War II unit. Again, that's at the very end of this year. So let's wrap this up. We've talked about archipelago, Shinto, Heian period, emperor versus shogun, daimyo, samurai, and the West forcing Japan to trade. Next up, you're going to do U5-L6, Women in Japan. Read the selected text from the Heian period. Then you're going to do the Unified Summative, which is the Chinese technology project. And of course, if you have questions or if you want to learn more, please let me know. I am more than happy to help you. And if you need help with the Chinese technology project as well, let me know because I will certainly help you. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.